Let's go back in history to where it all began, the division where it all began. We're going to start with what I like to call the tale of two feminists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Okay? Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her friend, Susan B. Anthony, both of them were abolitionists. Both of them fought for the freedom of slaves, right? But it was not out of any humanitarian effort. It was not out of any moral outrage. It was more that they likened the oppression of black people in slavery to the oppression of white women across the country. And the theory being that once you free the slaves, then of course you have to apply some of those freedoms to white women. Now, we of course know that that didn't happen, but that was the belief, the hope, the theory that, once you free one marginalized group, you've got to free the other. Okay? Now, what had happened was the 14th and 15th Amendments got passed. And our white abolitionists decided to go a different route when it came to achieving the right to vote for women. Okay? Yeah, let's talk about it. Now, it's important to understand that for Elizabeth Cady Stanton and for Susan B. Anthony, for them, women's rights meant that white women would gain the access to the rights and privileges of elite white men. That's what women's rights meant to them. That's what obtaining the right to vote meant to them, that it would put them on level playing field with white men. Remember this, because that colored how they would approach obtaining the right to vote for women. What they did was that they leaned into white supremacy. Okay? Now, because they sought to have the same political and equal rights as white men, they leaned into white supremacy. Because ultimately, what they wanted to do was further elevate whiteness. So it wasn't about bettering a community. It wasn't even about bettering all women. It was about elevating whiteness. Picture it. May 1869, at a meeting of the AERA, American Equal Rights Association, an organization that was founded by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, Lucy Stone, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Frederick Douglass, and others. Okay? At this meeting, Elizabeth Cady Stanton stands and says, "Remember, the 15th Amendment takes in a larger population than the 2 million black men on the southern plantation. It takes in all of the foreigners daily landing in our eastern cities, and the Chinese crowding our western shores. Think of Patrick and Sambo, Hans and Tung, who do not know the difference between a monarchy and a republic, who cannot read the Declaration of Independence or Webster's spelling book, making laws for Lucretia Mott or Susan B. Anthony. What terrors await? What terrors lay in the nation's future when clowns make laws for queens?" To her and other white suffragettes, they considered white women to be the true force of civilization, and therefore they must assume power over black men. She goes on to say that I do not believe in allowing ignorant Negroes and ignorant ignorant and debased Chinamen to make laws for me to obey. Now, Susan B. Anthony was a little more blunt. She said, I'd sooner cut off my right hand than ask for the ballot for the black man and not for women. Now, of course, all of this was said in front of Frederick Douglass, who had supported women's suffrage, who at the time was considered a friend to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Despite this, she opted to frame black male suffrage as menacing white women's dignity and purity. So she leaned into every racist stereotype, every racist trope, every lie that was being said about black men, leveraging that to appeal to white men to obtain the right to vote for women. So here's the thing. One, that's just absolutely offensive. You turn on the very people who helped you even get as far as you did, but because black men are getting the right to vote before you, your strategy is to appeal to white racists. You hurl insults. You use stereotypes, hurtful, harmful stereotypes to get what you want, alienating the very people who helped you get this far. Alienating the very people in the organization that you helped create. Because the other thing that you forgot is that women were not just white women. Women included black women, included indigenous women, included Asian women, included Hispanic women. So your racist diatribes, what did you think, or how did you think they would feel? But see, you saw things based on gender. You excluded a whole other side of these women's identities. And then you expect them to side with you. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper said, oh, hell no. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, you remember, we talked about her during our Black Suffragette series, right? She was a leading author. She was a feminist and an abolitionist, and she traveled the country speaking on women's rights and rights for black people, right? Now, of course, she's at this meeting that where Elizabeth Cady Stanton pretty much said that men of color were ignorant and did not deserve the right to vote, whereas white women, they really just said women, but we all know they meant white women deserved the right to vote because they would elevate society and elevate whiteness. Remember, she leaned into white supremacy to get support. However, Miss Frances was like, that doesn't sound right. No. Because here's one thing that you forgot when you're talking about women. There are black women too, and your assumption that we would choose gender over race is silly. She said that when it is a question of race, I will let the lesser question of sex go. But white women all go for sex, letting race occupy a minor position. She called out the logic of white feminists that they imagined a group bound only by the oppression of sex, and that they pushed race to the side as a minor issue. However, white women's emphasis on sex was implicitly a position that reinforced whiteness. Because if you're only looking at gender, you are not looking at the other components that make up a human being. If you're only looking at me through the lens of my gender, you ignore the fact that I'm Black. If you're only looking at me through my gender, you ignore the fact that I'm queer. You ignore the fact that I am of a certain age, that I am on the plus side. Okay, real deep in the plus side. You ignore all those factors. And by ignoring all those factors, remember, this is a time when woman equaled white and Black equaled man. So Black women had no place to land. So if you're saying we're going to give women the right to vote, you're really saying we're going to give white women the right to vote. Miss Frances made it very plain, okay? She said that Black women and white women do not have the same concerns and they do not have the same priorities. She said, yes, white women can be allies, but they can also be trouble because their commitment to sex and thus whiteness meant that sometimes white women were the greatest danger Black women faced. Now I want you to ask yourself, has much changed since 1869 when Miss Frances spoke those words? How much has changed? Now Miss Frances goes on to explain that white women may lack legal status, but they wielded plenty of authority and were among those who trampled on the weakest and the feeblest in society. Granting white women political power would not necessarily elevate civilization into reaching its loftiest heights, as Miss Cady Stanton and Miss Anthony argued. They said that granting white women the right to vote would elevate humanity, when all it was really going to do was elevate whiteness. Miss Frances was like, don't try and pull a fast one on us. No. Because giving you political power would not necessarily elevate civilization into reaching its highest heights. She said white women's morality was often compromised by their own racism. Yes, you can be oppressed while simultaneously being the oppressor. Miss Frances, I know, take a minute with that. Sit there a minute with that, okay? Okay. Now, Miss Frances says that I do not believe that giving the women the ballot is immediately going to cure all the ills in life. And I do not believe that white women are dewdrops just exhaled from the skies. Because, that was the lie that was told to demonize Black men, to demonize indigenous men for the sake of a white woman's purity. Lies and deceit. Now, for Miss Frances was quite vocal at this meeting, quite vocal, and she said exactly what was on her mind, right? She goes on to imply that the vote would not just grant political authority to anti-racist women, but it would also weaponize racist white women. And then she reminded them that the racist laws and policies were often supported and perpetuated by white men and white women. Don't forget, especially remember we were talking about the Black women who were kicked off of public transportation in our series before Rosa, and I cannot remember her name. It's right at the tip of my brain, but I can't remember her name. She was in California, and it was a streetcar. She got on the streetcar a block away from her home, And at the time, black people were not allowed on the streetcars. The conductor asked her to leave. She very politely said, "No, thank you." He asked her several times, and every time she said, "No, thank you." It was not until a white woman objected to her presence on the streetcar was this black woman forcibly removed. That is one of those racist laws, those racist policies that benefited white women and that white women supported. It's these laws that Ms. Frances was referring to. So at the end of her speech, she reaffirmed her support of the 15th Amendment that would grant black men the right to vote. Ms. Frances did not want to undermine the progress of black men by choosing to fight for women's suffrage over African American suffrage, over black suffrage, because that was the position that black women were put in. They had to choose their gender or their race. And the thing about black women, historically and even today, they lean towards what is best for the community. Now, Ms. Frances, as with other black suffragettes, they saw the right to vote being given to black men as a way to uplift an oppressed community. Remember, during this time, we've got the KKK running around acting like the law of the land because they were granted that right, but that's a whole different discussion. They were being oppressed under Jim Crow, and they weren't getting much help from the North. In fact, they were being terrorized in the North too. There were still schools that they could not go to, churches where they could not worship, areas that they could not live in. So for Frances and other black suffragettes, black men having the right to vote would provide political power to the black community as well as uplift the black community. It was not about obtaining an equal footing to white men. It was about bettering a community. Once Ms. Frances reaffirmed her support of the 15th Amendment, the AERA split in half. So you've got Ms. Frances, Frederick Douglass, and Lucy Stone on one side, and you've got Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and I do believe Lucretia Mott was over on that side as well. It's split in half. And two organizations were created from that split. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton would go on to create the National Women's Suffrage Association, which was an all-female group that opposed the ratification of the 15th Amendment because it was not accompanied by a 16th Amendment granting women the right to vote. On the other side, we've got Lucy Stone and Frances Harper, who would create the American Women's Suffrage Association, which was in support of the 15th Amendment. And now we know that Ms. Frances would go on and create the NACWC, which was also in favor of the 15th Amendment. Now, as you've listened to this lesson, and as you go on to do your own research, I want you to do the same compare and contrast. Because when we look at Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she has portrayed women's rights as a lever for advancing white civilization. And she used every stereotype in the book to gain favor for women's suffrage. Because remember, her idea of women's rights was equal political standing and privileges to that of elite white men, as compared to Ms. Frances and her intersectional feminism, which advocated for alliances and contact between enslaved and free people, feminists and anti-racists, and spiritual and secular beliefs. White feminism versus intersectional feminism.